Okay, and we're back. Hello, everyone. Thanks for sticking around. I'm here with our guest this week, Dr. Patricia Sawin, who was hanging with us for the last hour or so on our grand internet adventure. But now it's time to talk to her about her scholarship, life, studies, etc. Are you ready for that?
I'm not ready only because there's one thing we have to do.
Do it, Daisy.
The final thing before the interview. Patricia, chat.
Mhm.
Dom, you already know this, so I'm not going to address you more than that.
Excuse me.
Uh people of Earth, I don't know, people who are watching this in the year 2050, people who are watching this in the year 3000, people who will never watch this. I want you
3,000.
all
This
to
is
know.
going to be the what's
This
that
is the found
Sumerian
footage.
tablet that's like what's his name sold me suboptimal copper. This is the internet version of that, apparently.
The found footage. People, you might hear questions that we will ask. In fact, you will definitely hear questions that we will ask because this is the interview part of the show. But what you don't know about these questions that we will be asking is that it's not just me and Dom
Mm-mm.
who are coming up with these things, right?
Mm-mm.
We have a whole team of people behind the scenes who we affectionately call our sleuths, who work with us every single week. Every time we have a guest, anytime we need to research somebody or something, they are right there with us, curating questions to turn my dream brain into something that's legible and understandable. I don't know, all kinds of different things. So if you hear a question that you like, that you hear Patricia laugh and say that was a good question, whatever it is, don't thank me and Dom. We're here all the time. We know that you like us, but you should especially like and thank and love the sleuths.
And
They
extra
deserve it.
extra
They're really
help to the
helpful.
sleuths this week because
Yeah, it's a
there was like a tight schedule that we had to meet, but the sleuths wrote these questions,
yeah,
and
they did awesome.
let's knock them out of the park for them. Daisy, you ready?
Absolutely.
Patricia, you're ready. Let's go.
I am. I'm very curious.
I think you were ready. You were ready before, but Daisy had a whole speech. But
I had to do the sleuths.
we're
Anyway,
obliged. All right.
Good.
So first question, Patricia. In your book, Listening for a Life, you write that your informant, Bessie Eldrith, and I'm quoting here, narrated a self, not simply describing an identity that fully pre-existed our interaction, but speaking and singing herself into being insofar as I'm enabled to know her. Which, wow, 10 out of 10 beautiful prose. But what did Bessie's self narration help you understand about folklore performance and identity?
Okay, let's see. I, I mean, a big part of it, and why I talk about the idea of dialogic, sort of the dialogic creation of self,
Yeah.
is that it was very. I think some of the most interesting things I realized were times when she was talking to me, but also that there are some people. So for this, here's a little detour, but I don't know if you all have ever read Dick Bauman's. I think it's the last chapter in what is it, Story Performance and Event, which is about the Texas storyteller Ed Bell, and
Mm-hmm.
he was a very self-aware narrator, and so the chapter is actually is a quotation from something like, I go into more detail now to be sure. And so
Yeah.
that talks about the way that Bell used to tell stories to the men his own age who came to the fishing camp that he used to run, and now with the help of Dick Bauman and oh who's it'll come to me, the guy who worked on the fisherman stories, and his name will come back to me in a second. Um, but who was had been a student at Texas, but that they were taking him to, like, fourth grade classes and stuff, being a performer, and he understood very clearly that if he was going to talk about a bee tree, for example, that he had to explain to these kids what that was, because they had no there were all kinds of references. We were talking earlier about allusions, but
Yeah.
references to things that they understood what they were and how you would interact with them, and that he had to explain. And Mrs. Eldrith was really interesting in that she mostly didn't do that. And so that was all that in some sense she had an idea that I was there and that I was going to write a book about her.
Mm-hmm.
But in other senses, she would just tell a whole bunch of stories and talk about people who I had never met, and um, and that it was so that, for instance, I realized that I came to her with all kinds of respect, recognizing her as a woman who had done a lot and suffered a lot, and raised 11 children, and managed as best she could, as we're all trying to do. But that it became clear, for instance, that she was telling a bunch of stories to protect herself against sort of negative feelings in her community because they were among the poorer people.
Yeah.
And there's a chapter where I talk about, there's this interesting thing about working hard, but not working too hard. Because if you work too hard, then your life isn't well regulated, but that actually people look down on you and think there must be something wrong with you. And so figuring that out, and she would tell stories that seemed kind of defensive. And I was like, it doesn't need to be defensive with me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Um,
right.
yeah, or we had a wonderful interaction with when there's a video that we made about her. It was really Cece Conway, who teaches at Appalachian State, and then Elva Bishop, who's a videographer.
Daisy just put it in
And
chat. Thank you, Daisy.
I dropped the
okay,
link.
yeah,
It's on
Yeah.
Folk
okay,
Streams. It's free to
from
watch,
Folk Street.
everybody.
Good.
Yeah.
But when we came down to Chapel Hill,
Mhm.
and we were talking with them, and Mrs. Eldrith, because she was herself a very religious person, was quite ashamed of the fact that she had helped her. Not so much that she had helped her father, but that her father had made moonshine when she was a little girl, and this would have been in the 20s and early 30s. I don't remember when prohibition came to an end, but and Cece
Yeah,
saying to
30s.
her, don't, but remember that that was one of the very few ways that somebody in the place where you lived could take what you could grow and make a value added product.
Mm.
Um, so
Yeah.
that, yeah, and I don't know how much that sank in. Um, but figuring out from that, and this is why you do, participant observation, is realizing that um that seems to be a place where the notion is that either you absolutely do not drink alcohol at all, or you drink to oblivion and you drive drunk and
Mm.
go off the road, or you knock somebody else off the road. So that Miss Elders would say things like, I've often wondered about how many coffins was draped in black from that white lightning that my daddy made. And this is, she's
Damn.
75 or
Yeah.
80 and she's worrying about this.
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
so that the way, I mean, I loved working with her to try to understand the mind of a person who has had a life experience that's so different from mine. um
Mhm.
Yeah.
and who in some ways is so open to people. And it was like when I said to her that I think it's actually in the book, but that I know it is in the book, that I met her at the Book Life Festival, and I said, I need to write this big paper for school, and I wanted to, talk to a woman who is a performer of traditional songs and stories,
Mhm.
and
Mm-hmm.
could I come and visit you? And she said, "Child, you're as welcome as the water that runs." She had these.
Aw,
It was just so,
that's so cool.
so sweet. So in some ways she was like so open, and in other ways,
Yeah.
it really felt like she was um yeah, that we all live within the parameters of our expectations and our cultures.
Mhm.
What
Mm-hmm.
does culture mean but that? So trying to bridge that. So, um,
Yeah. I'm
yeah, so
thinking.
that in the sense of realizing that, I mean, when I said in that quotation, insofar as I am able to understand her,
Yeah.
and there are
Yeah.
ways in which, and for instance, I mean, I actually finished my dissertation and finished that whole book, at which point I was teaching where I am now in North Carolina,
Mhm.
and teaching with Glenn Hinson, whose interest is in a lot of his interest has been in vernacular religion. And he said, "Well, why didn't you write about Bessie's religious faith?" And part of the answer is that that's not really, I'm a story and song person,
Mhm.
but it's also that somehow that felt walled off to me, that I wasn't gonna
Yeah.
go there. And that one could entirely critique my book and my work with her by saying that's a hugely important part of her life that I couldn't really and maybe we wouldn't say I couldn't understand it, but I wasn't ready to try to understand it.
Sure.
Um,
Sure.
so, but that I also, it wasn't until after the whole thing was done and Glenn said that, I was like, you know, big gap in my work, but too late now.
Big gap in your work, but
So,
it
No,
wasn't.
but
It wasn't part of the dialogue. It wasn't the
mhm.
dialogic
Yeah,
process you were describing.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I
right,
Mhm.
understand.
right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
also
yeah.
I also appreciate like the I mean maybe it's hindsight, but just like the
Hmm.
recognition that like sometimes like you're not ready for
Yeah.
tackling a particular area or a subject and like to just respect that as be like that's
Hmm.
for another project, like I'll come into that when I'm ready, but being able to recognize that is an asset also.
Yeah,
I,
yeah,
I've
yeah.
totally
There's a
had.
wonderful, oh,
No, you go. You
go
go.
ahead if you want to. Oh, I was gonna say, the anthropologist Michael Jackson, has a wonderful line that I keep looking for, I can't find it, but I know it's in one of his
I
books.
hate that.
But he says that doing ethnography is basically taking yourself as the measuring instrument and putting yourself in a situation that you wouldn't ordinarily be in your life, and
Interesting.
Mm.
observing and recording your own reactions to that. And so that's another way of thinking about like how far can we actually understand another
Yeah.
person, and but he,
Or
meanwhile, I think it's
yeah.
in the book where he's writing about, the man who turns himself into an elephant, and has these kind of two identities, and
Right.
a human life and a animal slash spirit life,
Mhm.
but still to say there is some that minds are not completely transparent to each other or permeable to each other,
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
really interesting. Um, 'Cause that's, I think it's the thing that worries me, it's the thing that makes me really committed to, to conversation and to, like, what's the word I'm looking for? But, to the kind of to ethnographic work rather than, like interviews where in theory, if you have a set of questions and there are only certain answers, and the idea is that somehow statistically you ask enough things or you ask from different angles and you'll
Yeah.
you'll get truth. But the assumption is, and I remember before I got my job in Louisiana, I was actually living in Chapel Hill in the early 90s, and I got a job working for the program on aging in the medical school. Like, who has money to like interview to hire people? And I was supposed to, it was very interesting. The doctor was convinced that um, older people were often taking a lot of different medicine that was prescribed to them by different doctors, and that the side effects of the medicine were reducing their ability to function, but that they just thought that that was getting old, and that
Mm.
he thought if he could figure that out and like have somebody like one of the nurses in the elder care
Interesting.
clinic who could see what all they were taking and coordinate it and talk to the different doctors, that actually he could give people a better quality of life for longer. So that was all
Fascinating.
great. But I was supposed to interview people. And one of the things we were supposed to do, oh, he was also convinced, he was also wanted to test the idea that people believed that there was a difference between how long people imagined that they would live and how long, like if you looked at the actuarial tables, that with good care they would live, they could live, that it would be
That is
longer.
an interesting question.
Yeah,
Yeah, like
interesting
belief.
question.
Yeah, like belief in
Yeah.
aging and time. Like what the heck?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I was supposed to ask these people a
Yeah.
question, and then I was supposed, like, it was like, what medicines do you take? And some of it may even have been kind of a like mental, can you answer these questions that gives an idea of mental acuity? And then it was, then it was all paper. So I was flipping over the page, and I was supposed to say to them, "How long do you think you're going to live?" And what do you think the answer was? Because I bet you, as interviewers, can predict what they said.
So, okay, wait. So let me make sure I'm getting the context right.
Right,
This is
right,
like they are already considered an aged population.
right, right.
So,
And they've
uh,
agreed to be part of a study, but I've been
okay.
asking them about completely different stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And you just say like, how long do you think you're gonna live?
Right.
I don't know. Okay, so I would say if I had to answer that question, I would say I don't know, 80, 78.
Oh, I'll be contrarian and guess weeks.
Oh my
Weeks.
Okay.
Well, what I found was that they all said, "I don't know," which
Yeah.
That was
might
your
or
first
might
guess,
not. I
Daisy.
mean, one,
Yep.
it might mean I don't know. It also means I don't want to deal with that question. And
Mhm.
like it's
That's so
out of the
true.
blue, and
Mm-hmm.
how, like I don't want to think about that. So
Mhm.
I started saying to them, okay, now the next question is might seem a little odd, but the doctor wants us to ask you this, and so think about it, and if it's uncomfortable, let me know, whatever. And but what they're interested in the idea of how long is it that if you had to say, like, how many more years or whatever you think you're going to live, how long would you say? And if I asked it that way, I could get them an answer.
Mm.
I
Sure.
could get, I
Mm.
think it'll be 5 years. I think it'll be 10 years. Um, if I simply did what the doctor had told us, the only answer I ever got was, I don't know.
Yeah.
And
Mm.
so I said, but I was just some little, paid as a
Yeah.
temp kind of person. And I actually got in trouble because their notion of how to do a study was you ask the same question the same way to everybody.
IRB is gonna get you if you don't make it exactly
That's
the same.
that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And I was like,
Uh, yeah.
no, you
And
don't
you're like,
understand. It's like,
but you wrote the wrong question.
that's right.
Yeah.
Right, you
Yeah.
wrote the wrong question. This is a human interaction with another human being, you know,
Mhm.
younger to older. This person has come into the hospital to visit this clinic. It's like you're. I can get you that information, but I can't get it by asking that question. So, yeah. So
Wow, that's fascinating.
it makes, yeah, it really, I mean, clearly, I mean, this is years ago. Going back to that, of saying, like, um, you know, I just don't believe in that kind of, when people think they've got quantitative data from
Mhm.
doing surveys. Just
Yeah.
It's
Well, I mean,
don't tell the
this
sociologists, but
yeah.
right, right. I'm
This
not a
example
sociologist. I'm a folklorist.
we have a couple in
yeah.
Yeah,
chat, but maybe
sorry.
not tonight.
Yeah. This example that you're describing is also making me think about like narrativizing yourself because there's an idea that you have like consciousness, right? Like to be a self is to have awareness that you're conscious or some kind of consciousness, and like death would be the opposite of consciousness in some ways. So being able to like play with the self idea, I think, and the way that you perform
Mm,
the self through how you talk about your age even, um,
yeah,
whether you
yeah,
say I don't know or give a timeline is a really interesting way to talk about your own existence.
yeah.
Anyway, you're making me think.
Yeah, I mean, it is a really odd question.
Yeah, I wasn't going to say anything, Daisy, but yes, chat is all caps typing. Are you sure death is the end of consciousness? I'm more thinking that, Daisy, you seem to think that cogito, ergo S in this case, not sum. But
Well, I wasn't. I said I wasn't. I told Chad I'm not going to get into it now because this is Patricia's interview, so I can talk with Deathy about that anytime. But
yeah,
Florist appeared in the chat.
you stepped on a
very
landmine with that
excitedly.
one.
Well, whatever.
That's a
I
great
am interested in this question about like being alive versus not alive versus consciousness versus unconsciousness, whatever. I could maybe say it wrong, but the point being that Patricia, you're drawing attention to like the way that people are talking about their life or their awareness of that life, and then the time that they have in relation to that as being an indicator of their identity. Just like in the way that they answer the questions that you ask.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Yeah.
Death Loris, I know I have misspoken. Jeez, okay, I
Yeah,
understand.
even the classics kid over here is saying like, well, Lucretius just called death not the opposite of life, but just the thing that happens after life. You weren't afraid to be born, Daisy.
I don't know. Was I?
We're gonna. Were you?
We don't know.
I don't know.
We don't know. There's a reason you come out and cry.
Oh well.
Yeah, I was
Possible.
gonna say.
Right. Yeah.
We could
world.
literally, especially Daisy, I think, do this line of questioning the rest of the night.
Yeah, I was like, we do have other actual questions
do
for
have
you
other
that we're
questions.
creating, but
Speaking of babies,
speaking of babies,
Patricia, how did your research on stories told in adoptive families encourage you to confront or address uncomfortable personal and political issues?
Okay. So I at the age of maybe 47 or 48 adopted a child,
Mhm.
and she's now about to graduate from
She's
high
now
school
18.
this weekend.
pretty cool kid
Now
from what we
18.
From what we can tell,
understand.
pretty cool kid.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like the big lesson, before I actually answer your question, is
Yeah, please.
is like studying your own life. It may prove to be dangerous.
Damn. Chisel
Dang.
that in marble.
As you might have figured out.
I didn't want to look at myself this hard in the mirror. Yeah. Yeah,
Exactly.
dang.
Exactly.
But so important though.
Yeah. So that and I mean it's so fascinating that, like, I mean, Dory Noyes has done, a lot of people have done great work, but this question of what's the different kind of angle you have when you study a group that you're not part of, and in some ways you can't you can't probably ever be an insider, versus studying a group that you are part of, but that means that people don't interact with you the same ways, or they you know
Mhm.
but or you have obligations, or you have but what happened is, so my daughter was born in Guatemala, and I chose so much of this is kind of lead up to the interesting question there. Was that Caroline?
It was a combination.
Perhaps.
It was a combination of Caroline and another
And a
family folklorist, Chrissy Woodmere.
Oh, great. Okay.
Chrissy
Good.
Woodmere.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like, you don't necessarily have to rat out the sleuths, but
no, but
we're happy
this
to
one has
tell
a
you,
maker's mark on it.
Right.
This question
Yeah.
has an artist's
that's right.
signature.
It's like,
Yeah.
I know who
Knew something.
knows me that well, and
Yeah.
also is interested in these kinds of
Mhm.
topics. Let's see. So, I mean, sort of background stuff then is that that the whole business of getting of adoption is there are these kind of bizarre elements, which end up being that the first one being that if you simply conceive a child with somebody else, then you get who you get, Whereas as an adoptive parent, you end up having to make a bunch of choices,
Mm.
which you
Oh,
wouldn't,
yeah.
it's sort
Mm.
of this weird,
That's
like
true.
playing God. And particularly so it's like domestic or international. And then the bizarre thing, I mean, it makes perfect sense in a legal, sense, but it's like if you're, what are any entity that helps potential adopters to adopt has their own rules about who may or may not be involved. And of course, a huge issue in this country that makes my blood boil is the question about like whether you have to be married or whether what's a couple, whether a single person can, whether people who are gay or lesbian or not in a clearly opposite gender married relationship can be the adopters. But if you get into international adoption, then there's this question of like what countries will accept me.
Mm.
So
Mm.
that for instance, and I later saw this when I started studying and attending these like kind of summer camps for families with adopted children. And it's so like the Korea camp is so different from the Guatemala camp. And a
Oh,
lot of that
interesting.
has to do with the fact that Korea has always required a married heterosexual couple no more than 10 years apart in age. And I remember walking into
Hmm.
that camp and first having this experience of like, oh, families that kind of, look like mine. And then going, there are sure a heck of a lot of like perky ponytails. And, it was like these much younger
Oh my gosh.
women.
Yeah.
There's a
And,
lot of
you
high
know,
ponies today.
whereas you go to the Guatemala camp and like Guatemala did not require um that you be it allowed single people to adopt. It didn't They weren't so interested in ages. But at the point that I decided and indeed I had finished that book, I knew I had tenure, and so it was like this is a good time. I know that I will continue to have a job and I could support this potential child. So, but the places that I could adopt from were Kazakhstan, that I didn't really know anything about, the Philippines, but there's a was a limit on how much difference in age it could be. So it would be like I could have adopted a 13 or 14-year-old child from the Philippines,
I
and I was at
see.
least
Yeah.
smart enough to
Mm.
go, no, 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 no. Like I don't know anything about raising kids. Don't give me a teenager.
Yeah.
Or
Yeah, it's starting
Guatemala.
on hard
And I
mode.
had Yeah, right. Yeah, I had been to Guatemala. I had spent time in Guatemala.
Mm.
So I chose that, and I had it's then there were uh, situations like because China had previously allowed single women to adopt, but they were starting to change.
Mm.
And the story is that um, that they well yeah, let get to the actual question, but there's actually a very interesting story which I think is true, that there was a point at which I don't know if it was the Olympics or because it wasn't this most recent Olympics, but there was some kind of international sporting stuff in China,
Hmm.
Mhm.
and there was an ad that like a medical insurance company or something in the United States had that around that time that was showing one woman getting off the plane from China with an Anglo woman with her Chinese baby and being welcomed by her probably at that point her partner.
Hmm.
It is before marriage was legalized, but
Oh.
and that the Chinese government took great exception to this. And so that if you were
Mm.
a single that so for a while it was like, I mean, I have one friend who um
Oh,
wanted to adopt, and
this
she
is
and
like
her
so
partner
wild.
actually like she moved out of the house and got a different apartment so that her partner could actually adopt this baby, because
Oh my
if
gosh. Yeah.
if you sent in your adoption application to the Chinese government and said, um, who you have to say account for who all lives in the house. And if it was like, well, here's the woman who's going to adopt, but there's this other woman of the same age, then they were going to say no because they were
Oh my gosh. If
prejudiced.
you're
And
if
then they
you're a
just
spinster, well,
right,
you must be gay. So
right, exactly,
can't have any
exactly,
single
right,
women. You must something's
and
obviously wrong with you. Oh my
something's
gosh.
obviously wrong.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
fascinating.
yeah, yeah. So so different
Wow.
countries have different, and I actually had to put a statement in my like self account for Guatemala that said, I'm single, but should the opportunity to get married arise, then I would get married to a male person. Now, that,
Like as
I
though
mean,
that word is bond, I guess. Yeah, you're like
exactly, exactly.
like
So, I
what?
mean,
What a
right. Now,
ridiculous statement to have to make. Yeah.
Bron and I were actually already partners, but did not actually share a house at that point, but
But
knew
still,
that
yeah.
we were probably never want to get married. We're totally happy being partners, but not
Yeah,
being
yeah.
married.
Mhm.
And so like I was pretty sure that the opportunity to get married was not going to arise.
Just not yeah. That's
So
so
I could
interesting.
say that
Yeah.
reasonably truthfully.
Yeah, that if is
Yeah.
doing a
Um,
lot of work.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. That's so
Yeah.
interesting.
But to move toward the
Yeah.
question, I think so. So one crucial thing that I only learned much later and is laid out in excruciating detail in a book called Nobody's Children. And now I'm going to blank on the scholar's name, but um, who
Daisy will find it.
herself,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Is it
But
is it
it's
by
like a sort of a
Elizabeth uh Bartholet?
oh, no. Okay. No, Elizabeth Bartholet is actually a very pro-adoption person.
Okay, because this book is
Um,
called Nobody's Children: Abuse
Folks,
and Neglect,
Nobody's
Foster
oh,
Drift and
I know,
folks, my
that's
Adoption.
favorite
right, what
thing,
it
we
is.
are looking at a
No,
bookshelf. We are looking at a
that's
bookshelf.
right. Looking at a bookshelf. No. The critical book is called Somebody's Children.
Oh.
Yeah,
Those
Oh,
yeah.
two are in
So,
dialogue.
that
right,
is
right.
like
It's
okay,
dialogic.
okay.
Yeah, yeah,
Oh, that's so interesting. Okay, but yeah,
yeah.
by Laura Briggs.
Laura Briggs. Yeah. So
Okay.
Briggs points out that there's a whole interesting history starting with well, to a certain extent with the Second World War and Jewish children being, spirited out of Nazi controlled areas, but really starting more with the Korean War and just before that, like the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, I think.
Mhm.
But first was the idea that um, people running orphanages were trying to persuade Americans to give money, and it was like, it wasn't quite like it was like if you could afford to have another child, why don't you instead send money to support these poor orphans? And
Sure.
that then got transmuted over time and advertising into the best thing for these children would be to bring them out of the country where they are and to make them a part of your American family. Um,
Huh.
and yeah, which is a interesting and problematic
Sure.
uh, question. And then there's these very famous people, Harry and Bertha Holt, who started Holt International.
Oh
And
yeah.
they themselves actually in the 50s, yeah, Korean War, they adopted 8 Korean children. And at that point, you actually, there was no legal provision. You had to actually, they had to get an act of Congress to be able to do this. Um, but they started this international, what is now a huge international adoption.
Wow.
But anyway, what it seems to me happens is that people consequently go into the idea of international adoption with all good intentions. And in fact, my first layer of thinking was if I'm going to adopt a child, I have some connection to Guatemala. I've been there before. Guatemala isn't too far to get to. So if I had a child who wanted to go back and try and make connections, that's a much easier thing for me to do than Kazakhstan.
Mhm.
But the other piece was that I was actually had a little bit of political thinking, which is that I know enough about the reason that Guatemala is a mess and
Yeah.
there are so many poor people has a lot to do with US foreign policy
Yeah.
towards Latin America and the
Yes.
way that we have squashed efforts at creating a truer democracy there.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, well, if there's somebody to whom I owe something, it would be a woman in Guatemala, kind of in a different way than, say, another part of the world.
Hmm.
Anyway, that was my yes. Dom is
Interesting.
contemplating this, but anyway, that's how
Mhm.
far I have gotten in my thinking. Um, what what you don't learn until you get into it, until you. I mean, what then happens is that people adopt children from someplace, they get interested in the history of that place. And I'm sure that not everybody, gets into this, but I started studying adoption and started teaching a course on adoption in our American Studies department. And increasingly you realize that um, some places are clearly more corrupt than others, but that the question that at the very, very best, what you're looking at is a situation where a woman is forced by poverty to
Mhm.
realize that she can't um, raise a child, and or that it's going to be very hard for her to do that, and that there's some other option which she perhaps believes hopefully will give that child a better chance in life.
Right.
But
Uh,
there are questions of to what extent has that woman been strong armed? To what extent has that woman potentially been paid? Is it the case? There certainly were Guatemalan cases where you uh, where it's pretty clear that children were stolen.
mhm.
I don't think there are a lot of those. And is and
Well, and on
and yeah, go ahead.
I'm thinking about the flip side too,
Yeah,
like the
yeah, yeah.
idea that the adoptee would actually be a good parent, or would actually provide, like, on the flip of that,
Right.
like thinking about the hope
Yeah.
element, like that if there's a belief that this
Mhm,
child is going to a better
mhm.
place, sometimes that place isn't better,
Yeah,
because we have
right.
this like mystical idea of what it means to be American in our context or whatever. Yeah, I
Exactly.
was just
Yeah.
thinking about both of
So,
those, like, layers, yeah.
yeah. So, like, it's like even in the best of circumstances, you then end up with the problem of there's the other reason that that Guatemala was attractive to me is that the system that they had in place there meant that um, the child was usually with the adoptive parent or parents quite young in life,
Mm.
compared to
Mm-hmm.
say 15 years before that when the first girls had come from China, where these kids had been, I mean, I knew people in Boulder where I grew up, or my mom told me about people she knew who had adopted a child, and there were specialists for a while who who had developed and specialized in the what you needed to do with this child who arrived in the United States at age 2 or 3 and had basically been left in a crib with almost no human interaction for
Oh,
their whole life up to that point. So you
wow.
had to, you know, you can start with a child like that and recoup most of what they would get, but there was a lot to be done. So the idea of, oh, it'll be less traumatic for a child, but nevertheless, this child shortly after birth goes to a foster parent, then suddenly goes from the foster parent to the adoptive parent, um, goes into gets on an airplane, comes to, and so the question of, you know, it's like, well, the person who has adopted them then, is likely to have, more money, is likely to have more education, is able to give them more food, is able to give them more medical care, is able to give them more education of, of the sort that, is available here. Um, and that's all in the best case. Sometimes there are people who are messed up and they're cruel or they're abusive. Um, and then, but even in the best case, it's like, well, then, but how much has those disruptions and the trauma and then, I clearly look Korean, but the rest of my family is white. And, early on when this was starting to happen in the 50s, the wisdom from the experts was like, just treat them like your own child. And so there are now people who are in their 50s who
Mhm.
say, I was the one Korean child in a totally white, totally blonde Minnesota town, and nobody would talk about it. So,
Yeah.
now the wisdom is the opposite. You talk from the very beginning about adoptedness, but it's very hard to tell, it's and then even if you get to the kind of like, well, in the grand fullness of the, web of the universe, maybe this child was meant to stay where they were born and, be with their parent. Never mind, what's the trauma to the parent who was given it's so yes,
Yeah, it's
it ends up
complicated.
being very
Yeah.
complicated. And one of the most interesting parts about it is then that it was the one time I've gone to the meeting of a what's called the Association for the Study of um, Adoption and Culture, and there were some young scholars who it's like, because they were adopted by a, well-to-do, highly educated family in New York, and then they went to Yale or Princeton or wherever, and now they're coming out with critical race theory and decolonial theory and
Mhm.
criticizing however their own experience with their
Mm.
parents might have been, they're criticizing the whole system. And
Yeah.
and it's the thing that I would like to write more about, but I myself got kinda stuck in to a
Mhm.
point where I couldn't write, was to say so that I mean, what Laura Briggs says is, "You, O American, have all your good intentions, but you are so blinded by your own privilege and by your own situation and by the stories that your culture tells you, that you are actually doing this hideous thing, this hideous colonial, disruptive,
Mhm.
violent thing to this child who you were trying to love."
Mhm.
Mhm.
So that's the critique. And I think that there are more, and that's not wrong.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's
I think
that's a true thing, but there are subtleties and pieces. Yeah. Go ahead,
yeah,
Daisy, you had a
oh,
good
I
thought
was just
there.
thinking
Yeah.
there are ways that things can be true and contradictory at the same time. Like there can be two we can hold multiple truths at the same time even if they're incompatible. Like it can
Yeah.
be true that there is a colonial relationship with international and domestic adoption. Um, but there's also lots of people who are trying really hard to love. And I think that all of these questions can be, or these sort of feelings about it can be true at the same time. So I would be very interested what like new scholarship is saying, like about how
Yeah.
the system exists. How do we undo it, change it, reshape it? Like I'm curious what their suggestions are. And it still doesn't change the fact that then now you have this wonderful human in front of you who you've
Mhm.
adopted and it's
Right.
still there. So it's like you
Exactly.
can talk about
Right.
the theory at the same time
Mhm.
and you're like, okay, well, but now I have my beautiful child who I love. What do
Yeah.
I do? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I can
Yeah.
totally see how
No idea.
complicated that range of experience is, especially since
Mhm.
you like dove
Mhm.
into the people who are being probably the most critical about it, the people who are writing scholarship on it
Right.
too. So you kind of
Yeah.
not just went to like the parent group, but you went into like the scholarship group also, which is like adds an extra layer of heat, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, as a folklorist, it's like, yeah, there are multiple stories, all of which are true in their own ways or that people
Mhm.
tell. The one piece that I've published about it was that piece in a special issue of JAF,
Mhm.
with Diane Ty, her fabulous piece about, when Mary fell through the hole in the ceiling, and then Katie Borland, who's been thinking about
Mhm.
for a long time about these stories from her grandmother.
Mhm.
Um, But what I realized, and this is like if you have a very small data sample, and
Mm-hmm.
you look at it as a folklorist does, that there are quite a few people who tell stories that are um, like all the complications and that we went through and the barriers that we overcame in order for this child to come into our family and see what a wonderful fit they are, and isn't that a great thing? And so I had
Interesting.
4 actual texts and a couple of other, sort of pieces of stories from people who like told me these amazing stories and then said, "Oh, but please don't share that story because it would like reveal too much about my
Mm.
children's lives." So I could just allude, because
Sure.
that's always, I mean, it's all about psychology and
Yeah.
it's all about, you know, but what I realized is that at that point, like there are parents saying, "Well, this is the story that we told to help you feel like you really belong." And also, in many cases, those people believe that, I mean, at the very least, their experience was that sort of serendipity happened. And in some cases, if for people who are, consciously and explicitly religious, there was one of my sources who said God's hand was in it.
Mm.
There's a Christian woman and she really believes. Um, and so but then there are, young adult adoptees with a much more critical perspective who are saying, wait, but what does that mean? Does that mean that God intended my original family to be incredibly poor so that I had to be taken away from them, or that the government was willing to do this, or, there was corruption, or, somebody died, and that somehow I'm supposed to have gone through all of the upheaval in my life. Like, I don't like this story. Um, but the piece that I realized with at least this set that I had was that the other thing that is crucial in all of those stories is that, so there are two things. One is that I realized that that although mothers may have told them to their children, they were also telling them to other mothers. And I, in fact, had one person tell me their own story and then tell me somebody else's story. And then when I went back in my tapes, I realized that I had had that other person tell me the story. Like, so I had direct evidence of this person told the story to this other mother who then told it in her interview to me along with her own story, and that those stories were about the women, the potential mothers themselves undergoing a transformation.
Mm.
So in one case, it was a woman who was they were dead set on adopting from one country, and that country wouldn't take them, so they had to adjust that they were going to adopt from another country. Another was a situation where they wanted a child who was younger than a certain age, and the child that was offered was older than that age, and the mother both had to convince herself that she was willing to take on the older child, and then later discovered that apparently if their family hadn't accepted that child had been not taken enough times that they would have been like sent back to the orphanage for their whole life. And another was like a child that they didn't get the child from the orphanage that they thought they were going to, but there was another child who was brought to the United States, but then that family didn't want them. And so, and the mother had gone, in that case, the mother had gone home and went, she this is great, the way people think. She says, "I said to myself, self, you are fine. You are back home with your husband
Yes.
who loves you and your one beautiful baby who,
Yes.
needs you, and you are not going to focus on that child who you thought you were going to get to adopt, but is going to go
Yeah.
to another family." And then the next morning, like the woman from India calls her up and says, "I have this other child. You've never seen her, you know nothing about her. Will you take her?"
Oh,
And they have to go, "Okay."
okay. Wow, the way people talk
So
about
yeah, it's just
what
so Yeah,
You're right. It's like the decisions that you have to make.
right.
We got an interesting comment in chat
Yeah, read
from
it.
first time chatter. Hey, what's up, Laudanum?
Yeah,
I hope I'm saying that right.
Yeah.
um, yeah. So they commented, how would do you scale up this kind of study, which is really interesting for them to think about, and then back and forth. We were thinking about that this may be more of a critique of like folklore methodologies or this kind of methods in general, but because we're working with such a small scale of data, often, how did you approach like either scaling up or measuring what your sort of research group included in your project? Like when you were
right,
talking about the narratives, like when you're thinking about
right.
this from a point of doing ethnographic
Mhm.
methods,
Hmm.
like how do you kind of measure some of that?
Yeah. So, I mean, uh, I think they're kind of I have two thoughts, and we'll see if either of these are, well, that on the one hand, there's a way in which it's like folklorists can only handle like so much, and particularly if you are a sole person doing your own field work and your own transcribing and your own, um, so that it may well be that all you can do as a folklorist is to say, Here's a hint. This might not be the case
Hmm.
in every case, but here's a thing." And I have seen that also. There's a wonderful scholar named Marianne McDonald here in North Carolina who did a master's in folklore, worked in the state folklore office, and then she became she got a PhD in public health.
Uh-huh.
And I remember a project she did where they had like suddenly discovered that there was this was like figuring out how to stop epidemics of STDs, and like everybody had been focusing on cities, but they discovered that they were rampant in rural areas. And she was interviewing young people, and 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 I unfortunately can't remember the word, but she was like, there was this young woman who had like come into a clinic or was in a some kind of a program, and it was like she clearly had been involved in sexual activity and had caught a disease from her partner. That's the only way you could get whatever it was she had. And Marianne said, well, like, sort of like, well, when did you have sex with that person, or how I don't know what her question was. And this woman said, well, I've never had sex. Like, okay. And eventually it was like whatever the terminology was that generation of
Sure.
that cohort of people, it was like it was not having sex. It was something else.
Yeah.
Something
And
else.
so
Yeah,
that
interesting.
so there's sometimes there can be that if there's a bigger group that the folklorist
Mhm.
is to kind of help figure out what the question should be or help figure out what the terminology should
Mhm.
be. The other thing is, I think, exemplified beautifully by Tom Bowles' book called Overthrowing the Queen.
Oh,
Overthrowing the Queen.
yeah.
Great
Um,
one.
yeah, where he wrote some grants and he designed courses, and then he was doing field work, but for, I don't know how long. I mean, Caroline was part of that.
Hmm.
That's true. Yeah, she might know.
He had students who were doing the field work and some kind of systems for getting these interviews transcribed, so that then he, as the analyst, had a whole lot of data,
Yes.
that was good data, but there were probably 50 or 100 people who had been involved in collecting it and transcribing it and getting it into the text form where he
Yeah.
could look at it.
Oh, I
Yeah,
I
wish.
think you're right. That
yeah,
is honestly a really great like modern example of something that's making a kind of comment about a group of people or a national story that we tell about economics in the United States, but from a perspective of folklore, which we think is so small, but really maybe it's a lots of people doing small acts that come together to be analyzed. So maybe
yeah,
I
yeah.
think that's a unique way of
I
framing that.
I also
Thank you for
related.
answering that.
No,
Yeah.
I also relate to that because I just had my first interview with potential uh like folk life assistants. So, oh boy,
Oh.
I could have someone transcribe one day.
Yes.
Well, there you go.
Imagine
I
me.
know. I know. Yep, absolutely. So that was a very long answer to a short question, but yeah.
As lo-
I don't think. I also
could
don't
keep
think it was.
going all day.
No, it was a
I don't know,
2-line question. I don't think it was that
Yeah,
short of a
it was a good
question.
question. I think it was
Yeah.
I think it was definitely helpful. So thanks for addressing it.
Are we
Yeah.
getting to that? Oh yeah,
We're getting to
describe.
the
Very
time.
good. Are we getting to that other
Right. I
question
mean,
or keep going?
I'm
I
available. I'm happy to keep talking, but
You called
know
yourself a
what,
night
the
owl.
audience.
You called yourself a night
I
owl.
I am. Yeah. So
So you're cool with
Okay,
this
let's go
interview?
for
You're
it.
cool. We just keep rolling on this interview if it goes long. All
Sure.
right, that's a bonus for you all,
Okay, cool.
chat.
Yeah.
While Daisy, I think, parses that next chat question a little more. Right?
I think I want to see if we get an update
Yeah.
from we received a question, Patricia, that is, "Hi Patricia, what do you think of human consciousness?" So I'm trying
We'll get there.
trying to
Yeah, we'll get it. We'll get a
trying to get it
revision.
narrowed down maybe a little bit to something that might be
Okay.
slightly more
Okay.
addressable.
While
Well, we
they're
could
doing that,
say to that person that there was a great piece in the Guardian that I'm only 3/4 of the way. No, I think I just like a few days ago that was actually about the question of can humans can and I mean it's a thread here. It's like because humans are within are necessarily within our own consciousness is like how to what extent can we actually understand the consciousness of other beings and that we're
Wrote an article
trying
about this.
to right, exactly, but like and they were talking about the my teacher the octopus, my octopus teacher.
yeah.
Sure.
um
Yeah, I got
and
questions about that movie, but
yeah.
anyway,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I would not claim to be and I think I mean a thing I loved about the article was that they were pointing out how much and I can talk about this. I can see this in my own, like going to college and graduate school lifetime of the extent to which it used to be just assumed that humans had all kinds of intelligences that animals just didn't have. And now it's very clear that animals can reason, and also that, it's like, well, if you have a different body and a different neural net, like octopuses apparently, like a lot of their what we would think of as brain is like out in their arms. It's like you just can like how can we possibly and how and certainly we've learned that we shouldn't assume that our um intelligence is like at the top of some ladder, but
Yeah.
this of course always jumps me straight to Douglas Adams and
Mhm.
the white mice and the whales, the dolphins, so long and thanks for all the fish. But yeah,
Did
so
you say neural net?
I
Like,
think that's yeah, I
yeah,
think
yeah.
yeah, that
That's what chat wanted to know if you said neural net. Yes, I think that
neural
is
net. I
correct.
think
Yeah.
that was the word that
Yes.
this author used.
That's cool.
So
Yeah.
I can
I
yeah.
just wrote not to like totally toot my own horn, but I've been thinking about this with phytocommunicability. So the way that we talk to plants and the plants'
Oh,
ability to communicate, how does that look like? How would it be different? Most of it happens underground, but not so much. I always think these questions are interesting because it's less like, does it matter if we know the same? Like when somebody says, "What do we, how can we know that other plants beings have consciousness?" I think
mhm,
the more interesting question is like, what are our barriers to communicating, rather than assuming
mhm.
that consciousness that we have it looks the same across species. I feel like there's an
Right.
assumption that like, oh, my dog, when I want to know if my dog recognizes me. Well, yeah, your dog recognizes you, and your dog probably has thoughts, but they just might not look like the ones that you have.
No, Daisy, I
And
need
so
to
it
know if my
becomes a
dog loves me. Come on.
it becomes a well, it becomes a question of translation
Yeah.
and translatability, and like, can a human communicate across species when we are using different operating systems, so to speak, for translating that information. So I don't know. I have sources on like deep and sensory ethnography and stuff that I've just been thinking about. There's a piece that was written by John Hardigan called "How to Interview a Plant," and he's like imagining, he's not saying that you can interview a plant necessarily, but more imagining like if we accept the subjecthood of non-humans, what does that mean then for the basis of research? And if you were to do something like interview a plant or try to do a methodology that gives an attempt to grant subjecthood, what does that do to your relationship? How might you go about it? So he offers some examples of how you might do that and what the reflective process in those can tell you about the relationship with the world. Anyway, fun stuff. But not the human consciousness question was a chat question, so that came up from our very own chat, and we have other questions if you want to answer more. So
I'm happy to.
I'm just thinking. I was in Tarpon Springs with Tina Bugavalis, and I ordered octopus, and she went, "No, too smart."
Oh yeah.
So people do make that distinction.
It's
And
very
really
not Greek of her, though.
against
It's very not Greek of her, though. That's all I'll say.
Very
Yeah.
not Greek.
Yeah.
Going against her Greek,
Yeah.
her Greek training. Wow. Yeah.
Very
I mean,
interesting.
it also makes me, the first thing that came into my mind also is that that it takes us from very quickly from this kind of rationalist, like we're the, we're in the world and we're observing all of these inanimate things to to what I think of as a kind of particularly from various Native American group spirituality, where you recognize that in order to live, you are impinging upon and destroying and consuming other entities, and that you must be grateful. You must express your gratitude and your at least your gratitude. That it's like, I can't live, oh dear, without, killing you and eating your meat, and using your skin for my moccasins. But, and that when you start to say, oh, well, that's the case with, trees and,
Corn.
vegetables and fruit and corn and all
I
of
was
the
just
above.
thinking corn because in America you would have to thank them for 9 things every time.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But that and well, here I'll do a really crazy jump here, I think. But that if we think about, like what's the biggest problem right now, which is human beings are destroying the planet upon which we live, and therefore we're going to destroy ourselves and everything else. That on the one hand, understanding that people want that, and that there's this whole kind of, we want to deny that there, or there's a certain large segment of the population that wants to deny that, and to imagine that we can't have any life, we can't have any comfortable life if we acknowledge that, and to say no, that is inevitable. That is the condition of life, whether it's the hawk eating the mouse, or whether it's me, pulling the carrot out of the ground, or but that that accepting that, recognizing that we can't, that in order to keep living, we can't not be destroying other things, but that we can recognize that, limit it, do it in a respectful and thoughtful way, rather than imagining, and this is like the adoption stuff, imagining that we are somehow, we want to tell ourselves the story where we are innocent and pure and our good intentions cover everything, and that therefore don't tell me that the ozone hole is opening up, or there's so much CO2 in the atmosphere because of burning carbon or whatever. It's just like, I don't want to deal with it. And here's my really big jump, is that it seems to me that that is also at a really, really crucial point from a white person's perspective, about race and critical race theory. Because to me, the crucial thing is that if you recognize that we and our, that everyone here and the forebears of, for the most part, of the people who are now labeled as white have created a society which is itself totally imbued with affirmative action for the people who get labeled as white. Then, on the one hand, you can say it's, I've spent my life trying not to be racist, but A, I have benefited, whether I intended to or not. B, I now recognize it, and I see my own obligation to try to change things and to make things better, and to whether that's reparations or reconstructing society.
Mhm.
But I don't have to hate and feel shame in and of myself um, for saying, because that's that, it's that personalized notion, like, you're racist.
Yes.
Well, if you tell me I'm racist, then I must be a bad person and I must feel shame, and that's a part of what the parents who are afraid of actual history, say, being taught in our schools,
Sure.
they,
Yeah.
they'll say, I don't want my fourth grader to feel guilty. No, we don't want your fourth grader to feel guilty
Yeah.
either.
Yeah.
But
No.
it's to understand. It's not that I'm an evil person because I am racist. Label, Scarlet A, whatever. It's like, oh, I didn't mean for it to be that way. And yes, I feel extremely bad, but now I realize that if I have privileges, then I can start from the position I am, keep learning more, and keep trying to make things better. So,
I
yeah,
yeah,
everything's
well, and that
connected. Yeah,
makes
Daisy.
no, that I mean,
No,
it makes me think
no.
about the
Hmm.
difficulty. There's clearly some, like, difficulty in helping people realize earlier on in their life, their education career, engaging with these kinds of complicated subjects. Like, somewhere along the
Hmm.
line, somebody has to say, like, we're talking about systems, and we are talking about individuals that are parts of those systems, but we're not talking about, like, good and bad people. We're talking about, like, the less like individualized, like, liberal politic of saying, like, I'm not a bad person, I'm meant to be good. It was like, your intention is not actually part of it, because we're talking about systems that are kind of not engaged in intention in the same, like, individualized way. They're about these, like, larger structures that dictate the way that people move and behave in society, that, yes, you could make an individual action that is
Hmm.
bad, that you did not intend to be bad or hurtful or whatever, but that doesn't mean it still wasn't hurtful. And I just find that people get so hung up on their own, like, ego about it sometimes. But also, like, there is something about that disconnect between, like, just the individual versus the system that is, like, hard to kind of explain, that I think would help. I feel like a lot of, like, the general rhetoric, maybe, I don't know, Dom is, like, biting his tongue to, like, say something about
Only,
this, but
only
I know
because,
that you have a lot
only
to
because if
say,
I
'cause
go down a third rabbit hole, we're never getting back. But I have so many thoughts.
Okay.
I know,
Okay.
yeah, I
Can I
know,
do
I
it in
know.
one sentence? Can I do it
Anyway,
in one sentence?
All
yes,
right.
yeah.
Yeah.
To answer both of these, what's the biggest problem facing mankind, and why have we put so much influence on intention? It's almost like we are still living in a political and economic system invented by 17th century Calvinists, and we should really stop.
And we should really stop. I will
Yeah.
tell you a horrible. This is, I mean, like, people who are of delicate constitution. This is like the shock picture. But I read something that's going to make me cry. I'm so sad and angry about it. That Descartes,
Hmm.
we've been
Mhm.
saying,
Hey,
we can tell
he's
you
back.
or was, um,
Mhm.
uh, that he was so convinced that human cognition was completely different from that of animals, that he did. I don't think it said what kind of animal, but that he actually did
Yeah.
live vivisections without uh,
Mhm.
understanding pain and fear.
Hmm.
So if that's not a good enough, it's like, okay, fine. you know,
Yeah.
uh, we
Well,
we got to get rid of yeah,
yeah,
sort of
this
18th century. the 17th century thinking. Yeah.
Yep.
Well, some of that's about the stories that you tell about other beings, which is why I think the subjecthood of non-humans is very interesting, because when you start viewing and changing rhetoric around subjecthood, your grammar helps change those relationships. Anyway, we're talking about storytelling in a big big sense. Let's do another question, then we have some rapid fire
Storytelling.
questions.
Let me say one when I, oh,
No,
Yes.
go for it. Go for it. I was
Please,
about
well,
to
I
take
was gonna
Daisy
say
and transition
that,
to the question.
yeah, well, that it's a, I mean, that, so I was born in 1956. I was in second grade when Kennedy was shot. I was in
Mhm.
sixth grade when Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy and, Malcolm X were killed. Although, of course, nobody was telling me about Malcolm X in those days.
Mm.
But that I grew up, and I think, I mean, probably a lot of kids do still, but absolutely, even with, good liberal parents who were, they had moved out of Louisiana and came to Colorado because they didn't want to raise their kids in a racist society. My mom was an organizer for the Democratic Party, but the idea that America was a good place that was doing good in the world was absolutely foundational to me. And I remember, I mean, my mom was smart enough to like not understand it, but we went to see the movie that's called Born Free, which is about people raising lions
Mhm.
in Kenya. And of
Mhm.
course, it's white people who are there,
Mhm.
but, and, born free as the wind blows. And it's this lovely thing where the little lions are able to be freed and go back out onto the savannah or whatever. And I came out of that, and said to my mom, I bet they don't let them show that movie in the Soviet Union because it says that freedom is a good thing.
Oh,
Was I a totally
yeah.
brainwashed
Oh my god.
little 7-year-old?
Yeah.
And
So
my
interesting.
mother's like, "What?" She
Yeah, just like what?
but but that
It's
for
so
Your
interesting
me
mom
to
though.
was like, "Are you a cop?
really,
What?"
yeah, right. So I mean, for me in 66 years of life, that's like the change, even not from somebody, I mean, like, my partner, I don't think he would mind me saying this, he was raised by a mother who was in a very explicitly like the races must never mix. God does not intend that kind of a church.
Mhm.
And
Yikes.
so but for either of us in the course of a lifetime to have come as far as we have, even though, as my many of my colleagues continually remind me, I'm still messing up in plenty of ways. Um, but yeah, it's yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
I suppose one could say it's hopeful that people can change, but also it really shows you the power of those stories. Um,
Yeah, I think yeah, the power of the story to I mean, stories are told by individuals but have existences beyond any individual, right? So they're a collection of every time we tell a story, it's like a collection of ideology, it's a collection of belief. And that because it's not owned, kind of held down responsibility of any one person, no matter what actions you take as an individual, the story exists beyond you. So telling certain kinds of stories, I think it only makes sense that it would change so much over time, but then new stories get invented and reshaped and changed, and they get different kinds of prominences. And that's, I don't know, maybe just a comment on politics in general from a folklorist. But we're having this is
yeah,
so
but
much
I think,
fun. Oh my god. Okay, I guess we're not getting to hypnospace. Let's keep going.
so what is there another question?
There's Oh
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
Yeah, it is.
Oh yeah. Don, let's go.
Daisy, where do you want to go with this?
You're asking me? Okay, hold on. Well, okay, so should I ask that one just like that?
Ask that one.
That you've highlighted? Okay.
Yes.
So, this was like kind of a follow-up to a question that maybe you've answered before, but I think we could just like kind of jump right into
Just
it.
jump right into it.
What's something that you noticed about the field of folklore, having traced the elements of its disciplinary history that you wouldn't have noticed had you not done a project on the history of the field?
Okay. Um, let's see.
This is in reference to a book, which I'll drop a
Right.
link to in the
It
chat.
is. So, yeah. Well, I would say the first thing I'm thinking is that I worked on that book with Rosemary Zumwalt.
Mm-hmm.
She invited me to join her. But it's also the case that I used to teach, that I've had the great privilege of teaching the kind of history theory class to our incoming folklore MA students for more than 20 years, and that used to be also be a historical, there's so much new stuff, I don't do that anymore, although maybe I should. But um so that one of the things that I used to do with that, when I was teaching more what I had learned from Professor Paredes and then from Dick Bauman, was really thinking about like, it's like, what what did people in a particular time period think folklore was, and what did they think it was for?
Mm.
And then how do you go and catch one? Like, how do you catch yourself a
Interesting.
folklore?
How do you catch a
How do you
lore?
what's the method?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, how do you catch a lore? What's the methodology?
Mm.
And then what's the question that you can ask about it? And then, so that, like, asking that kind of set of questions, then what are the kinds of answers that you can get because you're asking certain kinds of questions? And that may be very different if you think that folklore is, Old English ballads, versus if you think that it is, memes and, you know, uh,
Adoption
stuff on Twitter.
narratives. Yeah.
Yeah. Or if you think that it's music, or if you think that it's, material culture.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, um, so that, that always trying to, I'm always interested in trying to kind of ask that set of questions, and which may also have something to do with, like, how we're bounded by our own thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
I mean, a great example of it is that just before I came into folklore, so I started in the fall of 1983 at University of Texas, and just like in the 7 or 10 years before that was when um, people like Beverly Stolce and Roseanne Jordan and Susan Palchik started, and Frank DeCaro, started saying, well, like, wait, like, why are we always collecting folklore mostly for men? Or, I mean, Frank did this wonderful bibliography early on where he realized that, if it was like a story, it was almost always people almost always collected for men. But
Mm.
there were certain kinds of things like stuff for children, or play party
Mm.
games, or that were
Mm.
collected from women. And so once you see that pattern, then you can start to, you know, and actually one of the really interesting things, so I don't know how many stories you've heard about the 1987. It was the first time that there was we did a whole day of programming, and I had a part of it. Beverly was part of it. Kay was part of one of the organizers. Linda Perching, to try and do a whole day of programming on feminist theory and folklore. And it was very controversial, and we had some plans, and the program committee wasn't happy, and there was also, most unfortunately, a some stuff that I, as a graduate student, kind of walked into about people who felt like they had been doing women's folklore, and Beverly in particular was saying, we need to figure out what kind of feminist theory can come out of folklore.
Mhm.
And they thought that they were already doing it, and so they weren't happy with what they were doing. No.
Yeah,
And then there was
it's
a
like
whole other thing with Bruce Jackson and the Journal of American Folklore, but um, in which your permission to use profanity might come in handy. Um, but one of the things that was designed was that the power of, I'm still fascinated with genre, but that the power of genre was it was so powerful in the discipline at that point, that I mean, I hear Beverly's voice in my head,
yeah.
but it was like you couldn't dare, if you were going to write about Proverbs, there was like, the whole bookcase full of stuff on Proverbs that you had to have read. And Beverly was always challenging us to do kind of outrageous things. So one of the things that she had us do, that was organized so that each of the paper sessions was like four people who were interested in a similar issue, but we were all doing different genres intentionally.
Nice.
So instead of saying, "Oh, you can go to the proverb session or you can go to the ballad session," the other thing that she got us to do was that there was some class we took with her that the idea was pick some like classic folklore text and do a feminist critique of it. So I picked the Kalevala, which is of course this like
Yeah.
combination cobbling together of a whole bunch of things. And
Mhm.
so I don't know if you know this story. So
Oh, I've heard this a
that
little
ended
bit.
up being, some
Yeah.
of this. That ended up being what I wrote about. That ended up being part of two different of something in Western in Jiffer and something in a book.
Mhm.
But the article that was in Jiffer, some Finnish folklorists actually then wrote to me and said, "Could we translate this into Finnish and put it in this book that they were going to publish, that I have a copy of, but it's in Finnish and I can't read it. But it's called Luen Sanat, something like that. But it's like the words of Louis, and Louis is this kind of witch, powerful woman figure, and." And it turned out that, I mean, it's like sad and money at the same time, but they said, actually, everybody in Finland has to read the Kalevala in school, and so nobody here is interested in looking at it from a critical perspective at all. It's just like part of the background. So, but anyway, except there were a few folklore. So anyway, they translated this piece in which I was pointing out ways in which sort of evil spirits get turned into women. And so Dom is nodding because you must know the story, but
We almost
um,
asked about this,
that
so I'm glad you did it
We
yourself.
yeah, we almost
okay, you
well, we
almost
should say the line
uh-huh.
after you finish it,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
yeah.
keep going.
Yeah.
Okay, then we'll see. But that apparently the book came out in Finland. There was a famous Finnish male folklorist, older gentleman, who wrote a critique, a book review of the book. And he didn't pay attention to all of this other great stuff that the Finnish women. He just said, "This book is terrible because it includes this article by this clearly ignorant American who doesn't speak Finnish." Like my first line of my notes is, "I'm just working with the material that's available to me in English
Yeah.
translation." So I had conceded that. But it was clear that the big deal was that he'd written a lot about this and I hadn't been able to read his stuff because none of it was translated. So he was basically mad that I hadn't read his stuff, which is not completely unreasonable. But the next fall, those women came to AFS and they said to me, "He wrote that, it was published, and then he died." And you, we're very sorry. You are very fortunate, Patricia, that he is now dead, because if he were still alive, we would have to translate his critique and you would have to write a response to be published. But since he's not alive anymore, you're off the hook.
Oh
So
my
we
gosh.
hope that I did not kill Matikusi, but it's possible that I
You
hastened a great
inadvertently.
scholar's demise.
Oh
So
my gosh.
I may be guilty. I may be guilty, at
Oh
least
my
of that.
gosh.
But yes. So um but that idea of saying, "Oh, well, no, I don't know everything. No, I can't read the Finnish."
Mhm.
But from what we can see and from the ways that that story is then spreading in the world, here's a thing that is really evident. Um, but it is an interesting, I mean, I think particularly if we think about um, folklore, let's see if I can get around to the book with Rosemary, but if we think about the kind of history of folklore as people who, you spend Francis James Child spent
Mhm.
his entire career like writing to people and getting I'll get another version of, text number 43
Mm-hmm.
and some notes on who sang it. And it's like we're so immersed in the minutiae, which in some ways is really important because then you can see things. But on the other hand, it means that you you limit your ability, and which is in any kind of critical paradigm changing, society changing thinking has to do that kind of be daring in that way, to say I don't have to know everything about whatever the topics are as somebody else has defined them in order to be able to say there's a problem here. And in fact, looking across those is perhaps the way that you find
I think,
the new view.
yeah, like as long as you know
Mhm.
what you don't know and say, I don't know these things, but the
Yeah,
stuff that I do know is telling me this under this particular circumstance.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
I think, yeah, people run into trouble when they act like their paper or their research or their one thing is supposed to be the be all end all of a conversation rather than just a
Your
stamp.
contribution.
Yeah,
Mhm,
it's
mhm.
it's
Yeah,
these iterate and reflection. If reflection is a key part of what we do as folklorists, then obviously we can keep returning to work and keep reviewing it and changing it and thinking with it. And we should approach other scholars' work with the same grace and thought behind it in
yeah,
some
yeah,
instances.
yeah,
If
yeah.
they're dead, we can't really help that.
And if we can't really help, but I mean, I can
This
give
book
you
could have been
an
nice, but that's
example
not what the
where,
actions. That's not
yeah,
what the
where
actions
I
said.
was, where I was just plain wrong, and this is like where, you ought to, your advisors ought to help you find better advisors. But I actually wrote my master's thesis a um about a kind of singing, like they're songs that go along with weddings in northern New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
And I was able to find some people in Denver who talked to me a little bit about these songs. Um, and although the woman that I thought I could get to talk to me about them, I knew her, like her daughter had said, "Oh, you got to talk to my mother." And she looked at me, this being what, 1984 maybe. This what and she said, it's like, white girl come to ask her about this, and she was a northern New Mexican woman, and who had made a living by being an upholsterer. And she just said, she talked to me a little bit, but she basically said, "I've ruined my hands, doing this work of upholstery, of pulling this fabric, and so I can't play the guitar anymore. So I won't play for you." But it was very clearly like, "Who are you, little missy, to come
Yeah.
and not understand my whole life and ask for this?" Um, so perhaps I should have been warned off um, to begin with. But what was interesting is that these stories seemed to. I'm gonna see if I can remember it right. These songs seem to be. Uh, I wrote an interpretation in which there were parts where um, it was like, I say or we say, and then these other parts where it was they say.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Um, and and I had a notion that these were two voices that were in opposition to each other, and they was a kind of a, outside authority yeah, Don, I see you looking a little a little confused, but I don't remember the details exactly well enough.
I think I'm
But
getting there.
that was my notion, is that these were really like voices in confrontation and in disagreement with each other. And I gave a paper at AFS, and Chuck Briggs, who shortly thereafter started working a lot with Dick Bauman, who was, my advisor, but hadn't been, I think, at that point. But he had already been doing his deep, deep work in northern New Mexico. And he just raised his hand and went, "No, ellos, that's, los ancianos de los antepasados," or something. It's like our forefathers who are totally wise and whom we totally believe. And it was like, okay, they've already given my master's degree. They can't take it away. But I guess I was completely wrong.
Yeah.
know.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And yeah. So that was, he was sort of nice enough about it that he didn't try to sort of knock me to the ground with his words, but so I tried to come up with some response, but it didn't take too long for me to realize that, because I had been working with text and I had not,
Mhm.
for the most part, I hadn't been able to interview people
Mhm,
that
mhm.
I had really misunderstood something.
Mm.
And one of those where it's like my Spanish was good enough with a little bit of help from a friend who was a native speaker to understand what the words were, but that I didn't know the context and the singers and the people.
Yeah, the cultural
This
context.
is
You can get
funny
it
that you
wrong.
brought up Charles Briggs, because when you brought up Laura
Yeah,
Briggs earlier, I was about to say like no
right.
relation, right? But I'm like,
No
no. Why would
relation,
I?
so far as I
Why would I
know.
veer into
Yeah,
into Charles Briggs now?
yeah,
Only because you mentioned Bauman.
right,
Now we've like
r-
completed the circle.
Yeah.
right. I'm trying to think what from the book about graduate programs I learned from taking a kind of historiographic or at least a historical perspective. As I think, I mean, one piece was recognizing how many places there are in this country where there were people in the 1890s or the 1910s who were interested in collecting folklore.
Mm,
And so there are a lot of places like Western Kentucky and like Missouri, um, and not quite that early, but by the 30s here, that it's like, or even the 20s in North Carolina,
yeah.
that why there are programs in particular places often has to do with something like that. So there's kind of that story as well as the kind of like Indiana planting its
Yeah.
runners in all these different places.
It's
Um,
interesting. Yeah.
so, yeah. And a piece that is not nearly as well represented in that book as it should be is also the difference between Canadian approaches and American approaches.
Mm.
And
Mhm.
that again was something that in retrospect, I think, oh, when Rosemary asked me if I wanted to help her edit the book, I should have said, no, you've got to get Diane Ty or Pauline Greenhill or somebody to do it, because we didn't. We yeah, there were some things that we caught, but that fact, and the fact that Lynn. I mean, there's a whole story of how it started, and there was a Western Folklore
Mhm.
Conference, and so Lynn McNeil wrote something about about the folks at
Mun.
Mun.
Memorial, but there aren't enough Canadian voices
Mm.
in there, and certainly not enough in the kind of the story that we tell about the rise of folklore in the kind of 70s and 80s and 90s, and the kind of struggles now. I mean, I continue to believe that that folklore is continues to be a really important perspective, but but uh, I mean, it was as early as the 80s when people started to say rats. The cultural studies people got that cultural studies name before we did. If we didn't have
Mm.
this, we didn't have this label that makes everybody think that we only study, quilts and butter churns. Life, our intellectual, we might get more respect.
But I like
So
quilts and butter
I
churn.
love hot buttered
I
ice cream.
do.
I love hot
That's
buttered ice cream. Oh my
hot
gosh.
buttered ice cream. That too.
But look at you
So
being
Awesome.
reflexive, like you said we do in our field.
Yeah.
Proud of that.
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Uh,
Um, we got some rapid fire funsy
yeah, you
questions
want to
for
rapid
you.
fire some fun questions?
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Patricia, as you did your ninth grade year at Cheltenham Ladies College in England, what's your favorite type of tea biscuit?
Oh, McVitie's home wheat with dark chocolate.
And
No hesitation.
no hesitation. And do you
No
dunk? Do you do a
hesitation.
dunk?
Yes,
Okay.
definitely.
Excellent. Excellent.
Definitely.
Always a dunk.
All right. What was different about your 45th college reunion than the other possible 44?
Oh, then the other possible 44.
Yeah.
Well, I did not go to any of the others. This was my first one, so it was
Okay.
pretty
Oh,
funny.
okay.
Figured?
Yeah, to go. It was very interesting to go back and to see some people who. There was one guy who I really wanted to talk to because he and I have good, not really arguments, but discussions on Facebook. But who because he, for instance, no, he used to have lots and lots of thick hair, and he now has very little hair. But so I knew what he looked like now. But yeah,
Uh-huh.
sorry, Dom. Um, but once he started talking, you know, it was the voice that I knew when I was 18 years old.
Aw.
That's so
And
interesting. Yeah.
yeah, and other people who look very much, or as somebody said, so and so looks exactly the same except their hair is white now. And when I was in college, I did not have bangs, and my hair was like down long and dark brown and long enough that I could sit on it.
Yeah.
So yeah, so
Honestly,
but
that's a
yeah,
70s, late
yeah,
70s, early 80s vibe.
yep, yep, yep. I mean, one thing that's great, and I mean, I'm now sorry that I didn't go before, but I think that I have more self confidence and more of a sense of like, I've accomplished certain things, I haven't accomplished other things, but, you know, I, I might have wished I'd done more, but I'm not going to beat myself up about it.
Mhm.
So that, and that it was a really lovely thing. I mean, maybe half the people I've talked to are actually retired because I'm 66 and a half, so a lot of those people are 67, or something happened during COVID.
Mhm.
Um, and other people are still busily working, but nobody, it wasn't like anybody was, um, they tell me about the amazing things that they've done, but they're just as interested in like, oh, well, what is folklore? And you're writing about memes? That's cool.
Yeah.
Or, um, so that was, then I think, oh, well, maybe I could have gone to the 25th. I didn't have to wait till the 45th.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. But,
Nice.
and lovely to see people who I hadn't talked to in all that time, and finding out about interesting things in their lives, and having, I was not like, important person on campus, somebody who a lot of people would know. But the people who lived in my what's called residential college, like my dorm, there were about
Sure.
10 of us
Mhm.
there, and then kind of another crew that I hung around with. And so to have those people recognize me and be interested in me
That's
is
pretty
really
That's
cool.
very,
cool.
very, very heartwarming. Yeah.
I'm
Oh,
sure
yeah.
the
Yeah.
feeling was
Oh,
mutual.
I hope so.
That's awesome.
Because I mean, I realize I mean, I love talking to people. I haven't done a lot of. I've been doing this meme stuff, and I've been busy being the chair of the department. As I say, for my
Yeah.
sins, I am the chair of the department now. Um, but it's like, I was also I had a couple of great talks with like the young people who were there to check you in and give you your key card so you could get into your dorm room. And I always love, I think in a way that's maybe because of being a professor,
Mhm.
it's like I'm always interested in, what book is the young lady who's sitting there, holding the gate open for us, what's she reading? Um, and but mostly was people my own age, and a few people who were like friends of friends, who I now have like a deal with. This one guy, it's like, okay, back here in 5 years, and we each promise to have a really funny story to tell the other one. It's like somebody I never
That's
knew before.
awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
Very cool.
So I
Daisy,
think
she
I recommend, yeah. And I'm
Yeah.
next summer is the 50th. I actually went away to boarding school my senior year too, but
Mhm.
the people I'm connected to are the people in Boulder, and so they,
Mm,
even though I didn't graduate from Boulder High, they keep me in the list.
Oh,
So the
that's nice.
50th
nice.
Boulder High School
That's
reunion
nice.
is going to be a blast. So
Very cool. That'll be fun.
yeah, yeah.
Daisy, she's mentioned her work on memes
I
twice
know.
in the last answer. Is it time to go for it?
I think it's time to go for it.
I think it's time to go for it.
You
Okay.
may know that usually towards the end of our interviews, after we do some funsy questions, we usually play a kind of game with the guest, very low stakes. We designed something different for you than we normally do. Normally, we do something like a tier list where people are ranking things in everyday life, but we designed something special just for you. So when
I'm
Dom
flattered.
shares screen to
One
us.
second,
Oh,
one
the
second, one
chat, the
second.
chat can see it. We're just getting
Jack can
some.
see. Daisy. As much as we do a lot of work on the show, we forgot to build out this asset, so I was kind of doing it in studio mode in the background the whole time.
Oh, it's fine.
Yeah.
Oh no.
Okay.
Oh no.
It's
Yeah,
ready.
this is our
It's ready.
crunch time episode. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Share screen to
I'm
us, and
sharing
so you
screen.
have to elect to watch the stream just like
Okay.
before
Good.
we're doing the video game. But
Okay.
we, Dom and I curated for you an Imgur, as Dom, like I said Imgur earlier. Dom made fun of me.
Believe it's
An
Imgur.
album of Jorts memes, and we want you to do a rapid fire Gene and Jorts, two most favorite cats on the internet. Just
Meme
do
review.
you love it or do you hate it? Meme review based
Yeah.
on any sort of scale that you want to go off of. Love it or hate it. But maybe
Okay.
before we jump in, we should give the shortest amount of context to Gene and Jorts. These are two internet cats, started as a Reddit thread under "Am I the Asshole?" Basically,
Perhaps the most famous "Am I the Asshole?"
Well, yeah, perhaps the most famous "Am I the Asshole?" post. What is this from 2 years ago, late 2021, I think.
Late 2021, yeah.
The cats jumped up. There was basically the orange cat, Jorts, and the calico or tortoiseshell cat, Jean, ended up standing in for like coworker racial discrimination something law. I'm sure that you know better about this, the nuances, because now it is like the Jean and Jorts are symbols for union worker pride, and they're anti-capitalist, and a lot has grown from the Twitter thread. So with that, Patricia, what do you specifically write about with Gene and Jorts?
With Gene and Jorts, I got interested. I mean, I was just fascinated with them, and also because I love cats. If we're lucky, one of my cats who just is so smart that
Yeah.
he just opened my door, so he may come join us in a minute.
You got a Gene?
Yeah.
You got a Gene over there.
I have
That's
a
smart
Gene. His
cat.
name is Leo. Yeah, he's very tall and long. Come
Oh,
here,
cute.
Leo. We have like flipper door handles, and he can jump up and knock them open.
Yes.
So we'll see if he'll
Smart.
come up here.
But
Yeah.
unlike Jorts, he doesn't get himself stuck on the inside after he does that.
Yeah.
No, he does not. Yeah. So what did I write about? I got fascinated. I thought there were different facets of the Gene and George story. So
Oh,
we got
yes.
Sabina Magliocco to talk about the whole question of like people's psychological relationship with cats and why we get, and like if anybody ever understands why cats have taken over the internet,
Yeah.
we don't know that answer. But and then that Andrea Quito is interested in disability studies and the way that this became because the conflict was one person, the person who wrote to "Am I the Asshole?" said, I think that Jorts as an orange cat is just, inherently like those cats all orange cats only share one brain cell.
Yeah.
And, if he didn't get the brain cell that day. And so of course he falls into the trash can and gets locked in the closet and all of these things. And so that,
Yeah.
gets a cup stuck on his head. And so, and the person with whom she was in conflict and who suggested that she was being like racially discriminatory was saying, no, we must train Jorts to be smarter. He can, so then this lovely, and then Jorts also didn't take good care of himself. So Jorts is, so they were so this woman was actually putting margarine on Jorts to try and induce him to learn to lick his own fur, except that Gene was looking it up, and particularly because it was margarine and not even really butter, Gene was getting sick and had to go to the vet. And
It's the best
so
part.
that's why I don't need to be tutored. I don't need to be buttered. I just need. So I love this one because
that is a good one. Yeah.
that your meme, that because as I just love this, that Andrea reported that
Mhm.
stop buttering the cat.
Yeah. Are you
became
helping
a
or are you
perfect-
buttering the cat?
Are you helping or
Yeah.
are you buttering the cat? Where somebody walks in and recognizes that someone may be differently abled and says, "Oh, well, they have a disability, and I must go and do what I think they need," rather than actually saying, "Could you use some help?" or
Yeah.
"May I?"
Yeah.
Whatever. What would be helpful to you, if anything? So
Nothing
stop
about
buttering,
jorts
don't butter
without
the cat.
jorts.
Yeah.
Roll
Yes, I love it.
All
I'm
right,
gonna roll
next
to the
one.
next
Yeah.
one. This is probably my
This is-
favorite
Oh,
of all
oh.
time.
Look how they buttered my jorts. Let's see, run it up a little higher. And then, or is it, or
Oh
is
no,
it,
that's the
that's
end of
a
it. That's the
different
end
one.
of it.
It's just
oh,
yeah.
look how they
It's
buttered.
yeah.
So I don't, because it's The Godfather, yeah?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't know The Godfather well enough to know
This
the
what's
other
his
is
two.
original
Marlon
line?
Brando looking at James Caan's mutilated, bullet-ridden body, saying, "Look at how they massacred my boy."
Oh. Oh.
Look how they buttered my jorts.
Look at how they buttered my jorts.
Oh. Yes, it is good, but very sad.
Sad.
And
A little dark.
squeamish.
Yeah.
Ouchie.
It was a rite of passage to
Yes.
watch that movie when you turn 12 in my house. So
Yeah.
I'm desensitized.
The Italian thing.
Very good. Very
Oscar
good. Okay.
winning. This is an Oscar winning moment. Just weeping right there.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Next one.
Okay. The softest paw can
so
be
this
a
is
claw.
this is a Gene.
This is a Gene
That's
one.
Gene.
As the quote unquote smarter cat,
As the
but also
smarter
cat
cat.
who's taking care of her friend Jorts.
Exactly. Yeah. So I like this one with the the explosion behind.
And the
because
distress lines.
Yeah.
like
The scratches.
Yeah.
This is the
the
scratch.
scratching.
Yeah.
Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah,
Mhm.
because most of the Jean images of Jean, she's just being very, very kind of cool and calm and wise. And to
Yes.
say, but remember that the softest paw could be a claw. That line that they got from the earlier song, that actually here's Jean like looking like she's going to be
Yeah.
jet propelled to attack you.
That's awesome.
Yes,
Jean is an agent.
very good.
This next
Yes.
one, there are very few.
Okay.
There are very few poems that are just so recognizable. It'll take 3 words for you to get, but this is just to say, I have buttered the jorts who is in the closet, and who you were probably keeping around for staff morale. Forgive me. He was adorable, so stupid, and so orange.
This is just to say.
This is just
Love
okay,
it.
that
This is
is
just to say
fantastic.
parody.
Yeah.
Yes, he was so stupid and so orange. Yes, that is fantastic. I love that one. Yeah, I'd forgotten. I think I've seen it before, but I'd forgotten about that one.
Every time I
Yeah.
see a "this is just to say" parody on Twitter, it always catches me off guard.
Yeah.
Next off,
All cats are beautiful. Yes.
ACAB.
It's sort of a subtle wink wink ACAB, all cops are bastards, all cats are beautiful. I think is the undertone.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Which
It's like
Jorts-
a double entendre.
Jorts
Yeah.
himself, the extremely socialist cat, might agree with.
Yes.
Yes, he is. He is.
I do like this one.
Great.
Last known view.
Yeah.
That's funny. Yes.
From the official page.
Yes, another from the official page
Right,
is
right,
this.
right,
This is
right.
one of them that started it all. This was One of the earliest
Yeah.
tweets from the account.
Oh,
I
Yeah.
don't need to be buttered, Pam.
Yep. Okay.
That's pretty good.
Next
This
off,
is a good one.
Let's see. You see this?
it's kind of in comparison with or in conversation with the opening one, but yes, once again, Jorts,
Yes.
Man of the Year.
Shares brain cell with sweet potato.
Oh, that's a
That's
sweet
right.
potato. Sorry, I couldn't.
Oh.
They're
Sweet
just
potato
so similar.
Jorts.
They're just so similar.
Similar.
They're so similar.
that was one of in the original post, right? She said he's basically a sweet potato.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Or
Yeah,
the
he's
intelligence of a
basically,
sweet
he's
potato.
basically a sweet potato. Yeah.
And we found the original Reddit
Oh,
post.
Yeah, the original 2 images of them just
Had to post.
they look so good.
Yes.
Next
Oh
up,
god, this.
Hot. Oh, I see. So we have hot. Now, do you suppose
This
the hot
is-
buttered ice cream is?
No.
related?
well, this is I
it's
can't
right
believe
in
it's
the
not
middle.
hot buttered ice cream.
I can't.
Right.
This is
I
that I
can't
can't
believe
believe
it's
it's
not
not Jorts.
I really
And
Yes.
then
appreciate that it's margarine.
yeah, it's actually margarine, not butter. Yeah.
Not much. Yeah.
Now the hot butter jorts, which you see before you, was
Oh.
not intentionally paired with Hypnospace's hot buttered ice cream, but it certainly works. This is a recipe for some kind of cocktail called hot buttered jorts.
Yeah, I think it's similar to like
I-
the Harry
Yeah.
Potter World Butterbeer.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and there is
The
actually butter
margarine
in
though,
it.
nice touch.
Yeah, there's
Yes.
margarine and brown sugar in it. So spray 4 festive cups with Pam. It says also specifically.
Right.
Is this the? Oh, we got a couple more. Oh, I went too far.
Oh,
Sorry, we got a couple more. This is another
Yeah,
one I
just
have
a couple.
to. I feel like I have to perform.
Dom
to
has
get
to sing
across.
this one. Yes.
Okay, Daisy wants me to do it like Leonard and not Jeff. Okay, I heard there
Yeah.
was a himbo cat
Mm-hmm.
and HR had to deal with that. He's not a sweet potato like reports show. He falls into the garbage bin and Pam was using margarine. I can't believe she fucking buttered jorts though.
Buttered jorts, though.
Bum.
Buttered jorts, though.
That was a very fine rendition, though. Thank you. That.
A little
is
out of my
amazing.
range, but
Yes.
thanks.
This last one, I think, is really cool too. I don't know if you know about this.
This is great.
but
It's just there's several. How
There's a
would you
couple
say
layers
semiotic
here.
surfaces?
yeah, this is like a super meta meme. So
Super meta.
this is
Which
yeah,
one?
it's a little small. I can send these to you
I can
also.
zoom in, I
Okay.
think. Nope.
Oh yeah, zoom. Oh,
Okay.
There we go.
Zoom
That's
in on
how you
that
zoom
one.
in.
Okay. Oh, there we
Okay.
go.
So, this is a image sort of screenshot from the game Stardew Valley. But obviously Gene and Jorts aren't in the game, but basically they the creator of this image I don't remember if it's a mod or if they superimpose the images of Gene and Jorts because there's a couple of them. But basically they
Yeah, I
treated
think
them
they
like
just
they
did
were
like
playable.
the pixel art in the style. Yeah.
Yeah, like they're playable characters. So this is like a game that Stardew Valley, you sort of have like your own village. It actually is a mod.
Oh,
These
it is a
custom
mod.
NPCs. Yeah, it is a mod.
Damn. That's a lot of work.
I'll send you this link. Yeah, it's pretty cute for people in chat who want that. It's super cute. Basically, they're like,
Hello.
There's Leo.
oh my gosh,
Yes.
oh,
You're so formally dressed.
oh yes, look at this little
Yes.
tuxedo guy. Aw.
Yeah. What do they need to-
Basically,
Oh yeah. I usually give them treats at 10:30. So
oh, they're like, this is worth. Oh my gosh, cute. So basically in this game you like you're in a neighborhood and you're farming and you're creating relationships and you like get to talk to the other non-playable characters. So Jean in this mod is another non-playable character, and she and Jorts are kind of on a quest to unionize the neighborhood that you play the game
Yeah,
in.
unionize the
So
farmers.
it's very fun. They're trying to unionize, all the farmers who are there. It's very good. Oh my gosh,
More
Deathlor's made a
power to
clip
them.
of us.
Yes.
Very cute. Yeah. So this is cute. There's also one of Jorts with the butter cup on his face, or the margarine container like
Margarine
on his
tub.
face.
Yeah.
Yeah, because he fell in the trash. And then there's some other characters who refer to Jean and Jorts throughout. Cute. Thought you would like that. It's become
I
like
do.
meta.
I do. One more thing that infiltrates these messages into, yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, it's pretty good. I would
Yeah.
say that a lot of people who play Stardew Valley probably lean politically in the direction that Jean and Jorts
In
also
the
do. But
direction of Jorts. They're on the Jorts
they're
quadrant of
the
the
Jorts
political
leadership.
compass.
Exactly. Oh my gosh. Well, that wraps up
Especially with the
our
cat
interview
coming in.
questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, especially with the cat coming in. We're about at the end of our show anyway. Thank you so much for spending time with us and just like
Yeah,
dropping
absolutely.
loads of wisdom and history and
Thank you
just
for
things
letting
that
us
you've
sit
taken
at
from
your
life
feet
and
as you just
scholarship.
taught us.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, this was
Truly
awesome.
an honor.
So cool.
Oh,
And
okay.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say thank you because I love, I mean, as I said, like being at that reunion with other old people, but it's like being in a small discipline, and so that not only do I know my own students, but I can get to know, young
Yeah.
scholars, and I learn so much from you.
Aw.
So
Well, we
uh,
feel the same. Dang.
Thank
Look at all
you.
this love.
so it's
Look at this.
a mutual
Yeah.
admiration society. So
Yes, absolutely.
yeah,
The
but I appreciate
enthusiasm enthusiasts.
exactly.
Hey
I
y'all, if you're
appreciate your giving me a chance to talk. Yeah.
and
Oh, yeah,
they've already done it. And
absolutely.
speaking of appreciation and giving,
Yes.
chat. Everyone who's still in chat, you better drop ladders for Patricia right now. I already see them
Yeah,
rolling in.
you
But
know what to
ladders
do.
in chat, you know what to do.
Ladders, people. Yes, Patricia, this is like our hype, our calling card, our kind of
It's how you applause in,
Okay.
yeah,
in
it's how you
emojis in here.
applause.
She's been in
Yeah.
chat. She
How you applaud.
knows.
Okay, that's
Yeah. That's why they're doing it. They're just
Okay.
applauding.
Okay. Good.
Awesome.
Well, I
Cool.
will look forward. Will I see you both in Portland?
You'll see me, but you won't see Dom.
I'm gonna be at Caroline Miller's wedding.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
I'm gonna
Yeah,
say
Caroline's
Sam's
wedding
groomsman.
happens to be aligned, yeah.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
But
Okay.
I'll be there and we'll keep in touch, and interview will be
Absolutely.
clipped out and uploaded at some point. We'll figure out how we're gonna do that because it's kind of long, so we'll see.
I'd say drop the whole
Yeah.
thing.
It'll be okay.
I
Drop the
think
whole
I think
thing,
this
okay.
was a coherent narrative from start to finish, especially because of how many times
true.
answers circle back on each other and address
That's
things
so
from previous
true.
questions.
Oh, very fun. Always fun to think with you.
True.
Likewise. Thank you.
Folklore.
Yeah.
All right.
Bye, chat. Everybody go to sleep.